come up, which is Steve, Nitah, Robin Barr, Mike Davies, and Jane Hutch. And so please come in and take your seats.
Assiccioli, Sinia se tolse a dasi, Ninaki, either brackets. Stephen Nitah fully considered step. Happy to be here today. Like Pete for introduction. My name is Stephen Nitah. I will reveal confused today and which is these are raised late. I've been working in conservation for over a decade. My ability establishing the Tiger and Net, Airdrop, Highland Area, and National Park Reserve, all under data and deepness law that we use creates guided or shares out in there. I've been working with Indigenous peoples and governments across the country, building the foundation for Indigenous leadership and conservation. Canada, well, the 160 of country was slowly about protecting 30% of the birds around the certain sound oceans that they have. That's a global effort to nature. It's an opportunity to be the 1/3 solution to climate change and to biodiversity. When I was negotiating inside the I was able to negotiate a trust fund, raising funds of philanthropy and private foundations that can't match it as a one-time payment instead of an annual transfer, so that my nation, my people had connected resources without having to go to Canada hat in hand on an annual basis to fulfill our another responsibility in the governance management operations of FIDPS. And that's what this is about for Indigenous peoples across the country and here in work carriers. It's about reassuming their responsibility to their territory, to their community, to their beds. The assimilation policies of Canada was applied to all Canadians. Canadians were conditioned to be indifferent to what their government was doing to Indigenous peoples. And their focal point when it comes to the application of that policy on Indigenous peoples was to take away their responsibility so that they become totally dependent on the government of the day. And that ensued taking them off their lands and taking their responsibilities away from them. 30% globally is the target. 30% for Canada is there. I realized back when I was on across country reading with Indigenous peoples and governments talking about the example of fighting in it, and I was told by the philanthropy and the foundations that donated money to us that they won't be able to do that again. It's too much for their blood. So I started looking at different models and different opportunities to finance these Indigenous-led federal conserved areas. And led me down the road of carbon offsets and other nature-based solutions projects and prevention. You heard a lot about carbon today and yesterday. Why are we talking about carbon? Well, carbon, there's too much carbon in the air. And through the Paris Accord, markets were created to support the sequestration of carbon or direct capture of carbon. And through the One Fuel Demand framework, which is created the target of protecting 30% of creating markets for biodiversity management. So these global voluntary markets and domestic compliance markets are being prepared today. The carbon offset market is the most mature, but is not efficient. It's not sufficient. It's not that's the reason why other markets are starting to be created and generated. We're going to be talking about one of those areas that we're excited about that we think it's very suitable for Northwest Territories and Northern Canada. These marketplaces and the interaction of these marketplaces require two major things that you have to be able to demonstrate. Additional, for a carbon project to qualify for the marketplace, you have to prove that the area that you're protecting or managing and create a carbon offset project was is being protected from development or threatened by man. So if it's an area, even though it has lots of carbon, it's not threatened to be developed or destroyed, then it doesn't qualify for the marketplace. If it's, a big part of the Northwest Territories fits that description. So the carbon market is currently not the best for Northwest Territories. The other major requirement is jurisdiction. Who has jurisdiction? And basically, what that means is, are you able to make a 50 to 100 year commitments? You manage an area without worrying about the marketplace, worrying about somebody else coming in and changing the land relationship or land use of that area. So if you're not a private landowner, then it's hard to achieve jurisdiction. But you could achieve jurisdiction through achieving the 30% commitment in Canada. Long-term conservation initiatives, you could create that substitute for investors for the marketplace. So those two is very important to understand this. So in Canada, to get this 30%, it's going to need to protect 15% more. We're at 15%. The remaining 15% represents culpable land the size of Manitoba's and Skyview Quebec. So we still got a long ways to go. Yeah. What we don't have in Canada is fast picks to protect 30%, but more importantly, to effectively manage that 30%. So what's needed is to participate in the domestic compliance markets and the international volunteer markets so that these projects can generate own source revenues to be used to manage that area as a particularly concerned area. So there's lots of opportunity in front of us. Big challenge, policy needs to be developed by provincial, territorial, and federal governments to support Canada to achieve not only our 30%, but to pay for the management of 30%. As I started with studying in Nitah, for example, you have Parks Canada as a partner of government of such territories. It was a partner of Indigenous government as a partner. The Indigenous government has a $30 million trust fund. It's a 26,000 square kilometer area. The parties have a let it burn policy. So what's the point of protecting 30% of the world, trying to give nature the one-third solution that to climate change, so we're just going to let it burn? So, Canada needs the global marketplace to participate. We do not have the tax base to pay for management of 30% effectively. And we don't have policies at this point in time to really drive investment into Canadian and Northwest Territories marketplaces. So that's key. That's going to be key for it. And we look at Canada as an ecosystem. Everything and everyone on Earth benefits from this ecosystem. We have to be able to tell that story, to market that story, so that we can attract investment from global leaders, global corporations. You need that. So I'm going to be followed by my colleagues. I created a program called First 30 by 30 to support Indigenous and public governments, achieve 30% to connect them to the marketplace by supporting the collecting the data that's required to qualify projects participating in order markets that you could find. And I'm going to ask my colleague Robin Barr to talk a little bit more to the 30 by 30, and followed by Mike Davies. Mike Davies is a guy from the UK. It's from the social carbon, and the social carbon is developing a protocol around what we're calling nature stewardship threats. We think makes a lot of sense for the northern parts of the country. And then all that following Mike would be Jane Hutchinson from the Fall Nation Foundation, based out of Tanzania, along with their colleague Ari. She's from Australia, and they have some good examples of what they've been able to achieve in Australia. They're leaps and bounds ahead of where we're at in Canada, and defining and participating in these marketplaces. And tomorrow, Friday morning, we're going to do a workshop here, fourth floor, from 8:30, breakfast at 8:30, to do a deeper dive into what it is, what we're talking about, World Nature Stewardship credits, and how we think it should be applied here in your office records. Thank you.
Can you see Will? I've always talked about
Right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for organizing this really informative workshop. I'm just blown away by the amount of knowledge and wisdom and dedication in this room. My name is Robin Barr. I come from Duwamish Coast Salish territory in Seattle, and I'm supporting the first 30 by 30 program that we're going to be discussing here in more depth. So I'm Stephen's colleague, and he gave a break in suggestion so what this program is all about. But what we're really trying to do here is find ways to provide long-term funding to Indigenous-led conservation. And we're especially focused on what's happening in the nature-based solutions marketplace, and really looking to kind of be a matchmaker, helping to take the visions and the projects that Indigenous nations want to do and find what are the different funding mechanisms, long-term funding mechanisms that could support those. So we know that Indigenous people have been caring for these lands and had responsibilities for these lands for millennia, but the markets don't know that yet. So we need to look at how we can shape the markets to be supporting the important work that they know needs to be done, the Indigenous governance know needs to be done on the land. So that's really what we're focused on here. As Stephen mentioned, the Government of Canada has pledged to protect 30% of its lands and waters by 2030. And as part of that commitment, they also recognize the role that Indigenous governments play in identifying and caring for nature. And I know Government of Northwest Territories has been really one of the leaders in that, so I applaud the efforts here. So companies, governments, individuals are beginning to make climate and biodiversity goals and action plans. And this is actually an opportunity for Indigenous nations to secure funding for your leadership in care to natural areas. So nature-based solutions markets are a key financial resource that can channel much-needed finance for Indigenous-led conservation. As Stephen was mentioning, all of the globe depends on the success of things like keeping permafrost frozen, or keeping boreal forests healthy, or really following the leadership Indigenous governments have in how to properly manage this area. So this is about taking advantage of that global interest in supporting conservation efforts here and using the marketplace to bring in additional funding, because we know that the Canadian tax base alone, with Canada's low population, can't fully fund it. So our vision is to create a network of Indigenous-led nature solutions projects with long-term financing and Indigenous rights and responsibilities at their center. Nature-based solutions are basically initiatives that aim to manage and restore ecosystems to benefit nature and people. And then the markets are the marketplaces that are basically set up to pay different groups to do these kinds of activities. So some common examples are carbon credit markets, biodiversity credit markets. Mike's going to be talking about the nature stewardship credits that are just developing. But there's also things that maybe fewer people have heard of, like forest resilience bonds or payments for ecosystem services. So we are trying to look at what are all of the different models here, and then what do nations need to do to qualify for some of these different ones so that we can once more play that kind of matchmaking service. Talking a little bit more about what we mean by nature-based solutions. Well, there's a variety of problems and crises that the world is facing right now, right? We're facing climate change, we're facing extreme biodiversity loss, harsh cultural impacts, the need for reconciliation. There's watershed degradation, there's issues around flooding, issues around sedimentation. There are different ways of working with the natural environment to address these issues. So some of the most common ones that you'll hear talked about are reduced deforestation and degradation, or RED, basically protecting a forest that would have otherwise been converted to a non-forest use or cleared for logging and mining or housing. There's improved forest management, often referred to as IFM, and that can be a variety of different aspects of forest management. So it can be about taking certain areas that would otherwise be logged out of logging. It can also be about extending rotation ages, widening buffer zones, creating additional set-asides for wildlife. So there's a lot of different practices that can fall under IFM. There's also afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation, where you're actually trying to rehabilitate a site. That's often called ARR. There's blue carbon, where you're working with wetlands or helping to restore kelp beds, for example, in the ocean. Peatlands potentially could qualify for blue carbon markets. And then there's also regenerative agriculture. So moving to more regenerative type activities like no-till, like cover cropping, like incorporating manures more to the soil. Those are all examples, things that could potentially build its soil carbon and qualify for regenerative agriculture. And then in the same way that there's lots of different potential solutions, this list is in no way exhaustive. There's also lots of different income opportunities. So rather than trying to go through all of them, I'll say what we're trying to do right now is really set up what we're calling an eligibility framework, where we can first start with the vision the nations have for what they want to do on their land, and then really look at what are the different protocols in place, sort of goals in place for accessing these supermarkets, and help them find the one that makes the most sense. So a lot of people ask me, like, what actually is a carbon credit and how many carbon credit markets work? So I try to break it down here. Basically, there's lots of different climate goals, net zero goals. You set the corporations or federal governments, and they are looking at how can they reduce their footprint, right? So they're making their own plans, their own commitments. Maybe it's net zero by 2050 or net zero by 2030. And then to reach those, they are making changes, but also for those areas where they haven't made changes yet, they might purchase offset credits. So 1 ton of carbon equals 1 credit. And so if a tree grows, it sequesters carbon, that's a credit. That if that tree would have otherwise been cut down, so that's the additionality side, that's a credit that could be purchased as an offset credit. Trying to go a bit faster. The rule of 30 by 30 is really to support nations in whatever way they want. So we can count ourselves as a general contractor. So, if somebody wants the full suite of support, we can help with project management and basically just take their vision and then help with setting up the project and access the markets. If they say, no, we only need help with this one aspect, we can help with specific aspects also. But we're also really focused on capacity building so that whatever aspects we do cover, we're building the capacity of nations to lead on over time. Somebody asked me, are the investment markets getting involved here? Yes, many investors are investing in these kinds of projects, but most of them want projects that already have very detailed feasibility plans in place with lots of data about exactly how much carbon or biodiversity will be generated. And that's often, something that costs money to develop those plans. So what we're doing at First 30 Minority is trying to raise philanthropic funds to cover that early feasibility study design. And then the nations have all the information that they would need if they do want to bring in investors. And then we're also building up a database of investors so that nations can, choose which ones they think are most appropriate and meet the ones that would be most willing to meet their needs. So, while many barriers exist in the Northwest Territories to accessing carbon, as Deacon was talking about, nature stewardship credits, which Mike is going to talk about, do offer an opportunity to secure the holistic stewardship and guardianship work taking place. In this case, 1 credit would be 1 hectare conserved, and they're not offsets, they're credits, right? So people are making a payment to conserve land, not necessarily because they've earned something else. So we're looking to pilot this in Northwest Territories, and we also really want to pilot it with Indigenous governments because we know it's important that the Indigenous perspective is included in this, especially from Canada. And so we're in discussions and would love to speak more with any Indigenous governments who are interested in learning more about this. The goal here, 20 to 50 years of sustainable revenue, getting people off of that 2 to 5 year philanthropic grant cycle, using the wisdom and the knowledge here to shape the global marketplace. We want to help fund IPCAs, their operations and growth, and we want to develop a tool for Indigenous nations to benefit from globally. So that's our team, and there's pliers that look like this. Feel free to reach out to me, and if you want to schedule a consultation, you can use this right here. But also Friday morning, join us for the workshop, and we can go and explore that. Thank you.